morning, everyone. I'm Dora Kingsley Vertenten from the University of Southern California. Thank you for joining us. It was early morning in Los Angeles. I'm here with my colleagues. To my right is Logan O'Shaughnessy, who's with the federal government, Deputy Chief Privacy Officer with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which works with the intelligence community and national security. To his right is Kate Connors, who's with the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. To her right is my colleague at USC, Dean Juliet Musso, who is both with the MPA program and now Vice Dean for Curricular Development and all other things. And our colleague from Syracuse University at the end, Matt Young. So, this morning we're going to talk about digital and analytics literacy to bridge the skill gap. And so I'll set the table. Logan will talk a little bit about the demand for skills from the employer side. And then we'll have two programs from Humphreys in Syracuse. And then I'll ask Juliet to do some wrap-up comments about also regarding the nature of the curriculum in our programs. So the question this morning is, what are the enhanced teaching technical and analytic skills that'll help prepare the next workforce to deal with both machine assets and human assets? Machine assets being that data which is collected by machines, generated by machines, and captured. I'd like to run through just briefly because I know Logan will cover it, talking about the timeline, and I'm really looking at this presentation and asking you to think about it in terms of the lens in which we talk about governing data and whether we're looking at it from a privacy lens, a security lens, or an open data lens. I talk about, from the research I've done with others, including Logan, sort of the four trends in e-government and the data sphere, which will move us forward. And finally, just briefly on the gaps in skill acquisition. So I won't go through these. Logan has a more detailed sort of understanding of the breakdown, but we're basically talking about a 50-year span about the nature of how we govern data. And you can move on to the next slide. Ending with the policy statements. The two major pieces are, of course, the GDPR rules and regulations adopted by the EU, which are now being litigated as we talk, and the United States adoption of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. These are the four trends, roughly in buckets, that I think about in terms of what we're talking about in terms of what's happening in the data sphere and governing data, the artificial intelligence and automation, the aggregation and mining of civic data that's created by our jurisdictions, the balkanization of the actual tools that are created to manage and utilize access to that information, and then notice and disclosure rules on data privacy. I won't go through the slide in detail, but this is the conversation that Andrew Yang is having in the Democratic presidential campaign. It was a focus of the debate. What is the intent of artificial intelligence and how should we be using it? I can talk through components on the right of artificial intelligence landscape, and on the left, kind of the trends in the corporate entities that are driving the development of these technologies. In this chart, we're talking about sort of a standard public administration matrix about the adoption in agencies, where they fall in each of these criteria: strategy, leadership, workforce development, user focus, and culture. Whether organizations can be categorized as early, developing, or mature organizations in terms of their adaptation and adoption of those technologies. This is one of my favorite maps, drives my students crazy. But it talks about, if you will, the technology to master data actually has a 3 to 5 year time span, closer to 3 than 5. So USC's online MPA program is now in our 9th year. We're at least on our 3rd generation of technologies just since we started teaching the course. This talks about the kind of technology that can be put in buckets. One of my students last weekend said, can't you all just pick 3 technologies you want to teach? All of our faculty will just use those 3 technologies. And I'm kind of missing the point about being digitally literate and moving forward. But literally each of these 9 categories has a utility to it, and then the tools within it, as you well know, rapidly change. The minute you master one, there's something else. And we haven't yet gotten to the integration stage. This represents the EU Privacy Shield concept, and the chart on the right, or the iceberg, really talks about risk. And so risk, as we see it, is in the top of the iceberg, but the risks to the policies and the implication for data are much larger, which are underneath the water. Cambridge Analytica, I don't know if you've seen the book tour that the whistleblower's been doing. He's been fairly articulate, I think, about what happened at Cambridge Analytica, but it's not only the compilation of the data, but who's using it and for what purposes. I come back to this sort of framing of what is our lens. The original concept, starting with a FOIA Act in the 70s, was to secure the data. We're going to put a cage around it. We're going to protect it. We've been poking holes in that ever since. But data is an asset which then can be capitalized, and we view data as a public good in that secure data. The open data philosophy, which really you can see in some of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act and in elements that are pursued as California and the feds diverge, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit, focuses on the minimization of risk to that sensitive data. Rather than capturing the data, they talk about controlling who has access to what on a need-only basis, and it sees data as a private good where notice and consent requirements are required. Here I've taken the four trends on the left, and this work was done with a colleague, Brandon DeBrule, who's now at Syracuse studying with Matt, and has done a great deal of work with Logan on what each of those trends means in terms of its secure and open view. And lastly, the gaps, and I'll run through these just really quickly. The gaps can be cataloged in sort of from two perspectives. One, from the participant stakeholder. What does the citizen have to overcome to be able to not only participate in the acquisition of the data or participate in the management of their own data, but in the governance structures that go with that. So the digital divide, literacy skills, legibility of city systems, the complexity of the governance process, all of those are skill sets that any citizen would have to master in order to actually have true impact as a participant stakeholder. And the next slide, from the government side, rigidity and detachment of the top-down mindset, the lack of trust between citizens and government, bureaucracy, clearly the lack of implementation resources, that's always an issue here in County and City of Los Angeles. But the scale of the critical issues, and at this point the scale which has to be overcome in terms of the resources to make those systems work and be legible and be accessible. And that's me. So sorry to race through that. I thought we would do a short presentation from each so that we could leave as much time possible for Q&A at the end and have a discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Dora, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you so much. And when I was asked to be a part of this panel, I was thrilled because I get to talk about a burgeoning career in a very important field, which students that you may have are perfect for, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And what's really interesting is we're thinking about, as Dora mentioned, as we think about data privacy, we think about it in this context of this being a very new problem. But if we look at the history of it, it's really, in fact, a problem that we've been confronting since the 1700s. In 1790, as you all may know, the US conducted its very first census. And at the time, as we were starting to collect information on US citizens and the like, the very first census was 4 questions. Well, that, as you could probably guess, did not really provide a whole lot of really interesting information that the government and policymakers could sort of glean. So we needed to collect more data. And they started, in order to account for the more data being collected, technologies and more primitive tools were being developed to make tabulation and analysis of the data much more easier and readable for those that had interest to the particular data. As you see here, in 1884, for example, was the invention of the portable camera from Eastman Kodak, and he was the first person that was responsible for developing visual data in a more easier way to understand, as we could think about it. Next slide. Since the 1990s, so going forward hundreds and hundreds of years, since the 1990s, further advances of technologies and the uses of computer has led to the creation of lots and lots and lots, and I can't underscore that point enough, of data that is not only of use to folks in the government, but also private businesses as well. This data includes data about individuals that can be used for marketing and a whole host of other ways to sell products and services and the like. It's become a business imperative in a way. If we think about data and how governments and businesses use it, it's informed a whole host of things that are needed in terms of how business is conducted. The Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, as Dora highlighted, is evidence of that. From a government perspective, we want to have good data to inform the policy-making decisions that we are interested in making. The concern is that as we are collecting more and more of this data, that it could be used for ways that could subject people and individuals to harm. And as you see here, this list here is actually the same picture that was taken in the previous slide. If you were to take it now with an iPhone, the metadata that it would show. And this is representative. There are more than 100 data points that could be shown if you were to take the photo with an iPhone that you could use for a whole host of analysis. And so the concern, as we continue to make great advances in technologies and we collect more and more data, that these inventions and business methods will give rise to threats and harms about individuals that require new remedies. Now, this would be a really prophetic statement if I were, or if someone were to give this statement today, maybe a business leader or government objective. This quotation was taken from 1790 from Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis in their law review article, The Right to Privacy. So again, even back then, this was a concern that we had been realizing and are now really at the precipice of where these new and inventive remedies are needed. Next slide. The problem is chiefly that legislation, regulation, common law, and other traditional legal responses, they're reactive and they cannot keep pace with technologies and data collection that are needed to solve this problem. If you look at this alphabet soup of privacy laws right here, this doesn't even include protections that are in the US Constitution and other governing documents that we have across our federal legal landscape. And it also doesn't include, although it's highlighted here, 50 state laws that inform this tapestry of what we do from a data security standpoint in terms of data governance. And so what's been happening is omnibus solutions have been proposed that not only talk about legal remedies and legal consequences for data use, but also serve as operational frameworks for data stewardship. So making sure that only the minimum amount of data is collected, making sure that it's shared only in ways that data subjects are authorizing agencies or businesses to share that particular data. And so there is a need, as we see here, there is a need for organizations to employ privacy-focused professionals to accomplish mission objectives and really start making headway into solving this problem that I've outlined. Next slide. And so what does this person look like? Well, in short, it depends. It can really depend on how an organization is structured and where privacy is best suited depending on what the organization would like to accomplish. But if we were to take that professional and distill it down to 3 particular areas, I think it would settle something like this, where this professional doesn't have to be an attorney, but does have to know the legal landscape in which the organization operates. So for example, there are a number of laws that affect US banks that are different than laws that affect US hospitals. And understanding what is needed and how to navigate that framework is an essential skill that privacy professionals need to have. Similarly, they also need to understand technologies. And as technologies evolve, what are those, how do they work and how do they transact data so that it can use to inform business objectives? So for example, we're talking about artificial intelligence, something that's been in the news. You don't need to be an engineer or a technologist or any of those sorts of persons that know the ones and zeros, so to speak, of how artificial intelligence work. But knowing how that technology uses data and how it's going to work further what an organization or what a government agency or a business wants to do with it is going to be essential for helping the organization move forward and continue to be competitive or make the best policy decisions it can. And likewise, it also needs to have an understanding of business objectives. So just because it may be a good idea for an organization to collect my social security number, it may not be a good idea if, for example, I am in a business where I don't need to know that particular information, even though it could be interesting to run different types of analysis to see where might people be buying my particular product and the like. Next slide, please. And quite frankly, privacy professionals, it's looking good. Privacy is looking good as a profession. I promise I did not write that headline in anticipation for this presentation. It came from a Fortune article that talked about the privacy outlook and hiring for privacy professionals across not only private businesses, but also government agencies as well. And I can go into a little bit more about this later. The US government is looking to hire a number of privacy professionals. We categorize them under a number of different titles that you see here. We also have a substantial contractor workforce with all of the major and boutique consulting companies, and also too, private businesses are hiring these people as well. And so what do we look for? Well, quickly, and we could talk about this more a little later depending on your interest in questions, but we are looking for people who are agile. And what I mean by that is people who are interested in working on lots of different things that may be changing at any particular day and at any particular moment. So if, for example, you are working on a governance document, let's say a privacy impact assessment, to see what a technology is going to, how a technology is going to be used and impact privacy within an organization, and then a data breach happens, that's something that you will need to drop, and you'll need to have a separate set of skills in order to best address the data breach within an organization. You're going to work with a diverse set of stakeholders. And as I mentioned in the previous slide with that Venn diagram, you're going to work with people who are in a general counsel's office, or you're going to be working with attorneys. You're going to be working with your chief information officer. You're going to be working with people who are on the front lines, and if they're taking a questionnaire, for example, what are the types of data that you're looking to collect, and do we need those sorts of things? You are going to know your organization inside and out, because data is what is running it and what is fueling the decisions that it is making. You're also going to need to have a sense of business savvy. There's going to be people who are going to oppose, for example, your recommendation that certain data may not be collected. And you're going to need to be able to ask certain questions to make sure that the business is still able to obtain its objectives that it wants, while still negotiating the types of data that it is collecting, especially because these types of data collections and the analysis it wants to run may be changing over time. And finally, you're going to be interested in multidisciplinary growth and study. You may have students that do not want at all to learn about being a data scientist, and that's fine. I am not a data scientist at all, nor do I ever hope to be one. But they should be interested in learning how to speak their language so that they are able to best serve the interests of the organization from where they sit. And that is why, based on the types of work that your students are doing, they are so well suited of being privacy professionals because of the diverse projects they work on, the different audiences that they work with, the different stakeholder groups, and the working within an organization and being leaders within the organizations in which they would like to operate in. And my contact information is here, and I look forward to our discussion later on in the program.
So I'm going to be talking specifically about digital literacy. I see digital literacy as the art of data literacy. Once we have the analysis, how do we communicate that? So I'm going to be spending just a few minutes talking about some ideas of how you can integrate into your curriculum some digital literacy opportunities, because I believe that the more often that we provide our students these kinds of experiences to use and increase their digital literacy fluency, then they are better prepared to participate with Logan here. So the first thing that I'd like to do is go through just very briefly a couple of frameworks. And there's many frameworks around digital literacy skills. Many of them look like this, very linear, and ranging, because digital literacy is very nuanced and very complex. They have sort of, it's very complicated sometimes to figure out how to create a framework to guide us on how we develop those kinds of skills and how do we provide those kinds of opportunities. And the reason that I don't like the linear digital literacy frameworks is that it makes one believe that developing digital literacy is sequential, and it isn't really. I prefer a framework more like this. This is hard to read, but again, I'm going to encourage you to download this PowerPoint presentation so that you can go back to this. This is a metaphor for a metro map. And it really is conveying the idea that our students are going to hop on wherever they're at, and we can at any point in time create assignments that allow them to explore or use the experiences that they come with. What we know now is that there are K-12 standards around digital literacy skills, so our students come to us with a lot of experience already. So we need to provide a lot of different kinds of opportunities to allow them to demonstrate their knowledge in a variety of ways using different digital literacy opportunities. So how do we get there? What do we need to do? And I'm going to be sharing 4 different lessons with you very briefly. And then the other thing that I want to encourage you to do is to download the rubrics that go with these lessons. I believe very strongly in providing our students rubrics because that's the framework. That's how we tell them we're going to assign value to different aspects of it right at the starting gate, so they know exactly how we're going to measure their success, their effectiveness. So the first assignment, all of these assignments, by the way, are basically, they can be used in a face-to-face, a blended, or an online delivery modality. They can be a single assignment, or they can be a semester-long group project. So this first one is using a tool called Wakelet. Wakelet is a cloud-based tool, and the purpose of it is to really curate a lot of different disjointed pieces of information that you can find on the web. Articles, videos, blogs, tweets, documents, and websites. So this is a great way for students to also not only complete this project, but they begin to, through this experience, start to develop their own knowledge network and begin to see who the thought leaders are that are taking up the social media space that they can begin to network as they go through this experience. So we have this particular assignment in one of our online programs for the Certificate in Election Administration. I don't expect you to read this, but in this particular assignment, the students have to take one of these 2 questions and develop a Wakelet web page on any of these chosen topics. And they do this throughout, this particular class runs for half a semester. So they have 7 weeks to pull together this web page, and then there's some peer review at the end of it. The web page looks like this after it's been pulled together. This is a scrolling web page, and this is just a screenshot. So a Wakelet web page goes on much longer. And again, because we have a rubric, the students, in addition to the instructor of record, the students use this rubric to provide feedback to their colleagues. The thing that I also appreciate about the Wakelet organization is they just added a very important component called Microsoft Immersive Reader, where by clicking on this icon, it translates the text into another language. And that is, of course, really important for our students whose first language is not English, and I wanted to highlight that. Another kind of digital literacy skill is visual communication, data visualization, infographics, different kinds of charts. And I wanted to share with you a group of tools that are open source. The one that I like to use is down in the lower right, Easily. And I encourage you to investigate these. These are free tools. It's a nice way to get your students into creating charts. Very quickly, I'll go through the last 2. So a video investigation project, and this is a semester-long project that I co-instruct with the excuse me, instructor of record. So they offload all of the technology aspects to myself, and I work with the student groups, and I go through all of the technology support, help them. I go into the class several times a semester and work independently with the student groups to go through pre-production, production, post-production, how to queue up the subject matter experts, how to create some original graphics, how to use music to emphasize certain points. And there's a rubric for this particular project at the end. And then finally, one of the other projects that we run, and I'm doing 2 of them right now this semester, is an e-study. And again, there's a couple of authoring tools that I have sourced at the end of this. And this is another project where I partner with I'm a co-instructor, and I partner with the instructor to help the student groups frame up their topic with the background information, learning outcomes, conceptual frameworks, how many modules that they want to have. So I help them tee it up so they don't have to spend time on really thinking it through the creative piece, and they can just work on this and get going. And a lot of these assignments accompany other kinds of outputs, like a policy brief or whatever. The other thing that I'll say is I think it's really important for students to have these kinds of experiences because as Logan was referring to, they have to be agile, and they have to move quickly. And when you create these kinds of assignments that have a lot of different components to it, they're able to have those experiences in our learning environment. And I believe that that is an important element of the kind of education we need to provide in a public affairs, public policy school. So again, the website that has the additional resources is z, as in zebra, .umn.edu/NASPAA.
So good morning, everyone. I am fortunate enough to teach a new class at Maxwell called Data-Driven Decision Making. and it is the intro class to our new certificate in data analytics and public policy. And just by a quick way of background, I was a software engineer and product manager for about 10 years after undergrad and during undergrad before going back to graduate school. And to keep up with the music metaphor, John Coltrane did not receive an MFA. He didn't receive a bachelor's in music arts. His mom bought him an alto sax when he was in early high school or junior high, and he started experimenting. And it's that sort of curiosity and approach to seeing how you can take a tool or an instrument and make something of it. That's really the fundamental skill behind giving our MPA and MPP students a shot at actually advancing digital literacy and becoming hackers, right? And so I just want to emphasize that the best hackers, right, they're not classically trained per se. They're not the ones that are coming out of computer science programs. The best engineers that I worked with were philosophy undergrads. Why? Because they understood the logic and how to systematically analyze and break down problems into discrete elements that they could then tackle. That's the essence, really, of doing anything related to data management, data analysis, software, design, any of that. It's really the critical thinking and logic that are the sine qua non. And so, just as an illustrative example of that, so the first time I taught data-driven decision-making was in the spring semester. And so when I repackaged it and started teaching it this fall, I noticed that even though the students across the two classes had the same sort of average level of technical competency based on the quizzes and other sort of things I used at the beginning of the semester to feel out what the baseline was, they were having a much harder time initially getting the gist of what I was trying to teach them on the technical side of the class. And it finally hit me that they didn't have that first fall semester under their belts, where even though they weren't ever exposed to doing anything in Python, they were exposed to the need to think critically and systematically about analyzing, diagnosing, and breaking down problems, right? That immediately transfers into the sort of work that our students are going to be expected to do with respect to digital technology and tools. The specific language comes and goes, right? Our department fought a pitched battle before I got there to move from SPSS to Stata. And now they're like, by the way, we should figure out whether we want to use R or Python in our data certificate program. And I went with Python expecting that in a few years we'll move over to Julia once it's more robust, and then a few years after that we'll move into whatever's next. So, worrying over much about whether the students understand the syntax of any particular language for doing any of this work is really immaterial. It's second order at best. You really, in my view, need to focus on just working with them to think, okay, what's the nature of the problem I need to solve? What tools are available in this package, this library, whatever the case may be, and how can I think about mapping those different tools to the raw material, the data that I have in a way that's going to let me get to the outcome that I need. And that's really the sort of systems level thinking that separates the sort of rote cookie cutter computer science, computer engineer from, say, a systems architect, someone who can actually think about the way that the entire superstructure needs to look. And that Also, I do want to emphasize from my perspective, ultimately, we're in the business of training managers, directors, leaders, right? Not the people that are going to be perpetually in the role of data analyst one. We want people that know how to manage a whole division or department of data analysts and do it well. And so that's really, just to plug what we're doing over in Syracuse, the crux of our approach to this certificate program is, we do need to give them the technical chops so that when they jump into wherever they go after we're done teaching them, that they have the basic facility with the language, right? They can read the sheet music and get going. But really, where the value add for the program is teaching them how to effectively teach themselves on the fly and going forward. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about what we did, and I got to punch a little bit above my weight as an assistant professor and worked my way onto the search committee for this. But the first person that we hired as the signature hire for this program is a PhD in philosophy who studies ethics. And I think that's going to be one of the most valuable things that we can provide the students who come through our program, is how to think critically, logically about the ethical issues that are raised by these technologies.
I actually want to talk about, and I think this actually speaks to a lot of what folks said, especially Matt and Kate. It's less specialized than what Logan is working on. And so this is sort of my greatest hits of the kind of tensions, I think, as we move our students into this increasingly complex digital age, which is, and I have 3 slides after this, either using the internet and kind of web-based research to do deep and meaningful research on policy issues, as opposed to using it in a sort of quick and dirty way that reinforces people's preconceptions, which I think is a real risk. The second is, do we have students actually understand the technical applications that they're using, especially with advanced data analytics, or do we just have kind of punch and go data analytics that students use without actually understanding it fully? I'd love to have Matt speak to that after. And then the third one is how you think about civic engagement in this increasingly complex digital age. And again, I think our field as a whole has somewhat of a bias of training folks to be technocrats, and I fear that the ability to program technology to reinforce those kinds of institutional barriers is something that we need to be attentive to in the curriculum. So I just want to hit on each one of those real quick. So Craig and I were both at the Goldman School of Public Policy in the early days, and we had something called the 48-hour project, which you probably remember. And we actually drew a topic out of a hat, and then we had 48 hours to go research it. Now, if I told my students that now, they would just laugh, because they could actually do the amount of research that it took me 2 days in the library to do in about 48 minutes. And the students now have such an amazing opportunity to really dig deep into topics. And now what I'm seeing actually is that in every class I teach, whether it's at the beginning of the curriculum or even at the end of the curriculum, is that students easily kind of lapse back into thinking about their own preconceptions, and they use the web to quickly find research that I think reinforces their presuppositions about a particular project. And so the question is, how do we I don't know exactly how to teach across the curriculum the ability really to use those web research capabilities really critically, because that's one of the themes that we heard across every speaker. Critical use of information is one of the most important skills that our students can learn, and now they can get as much information as they want, as quickly as they need to get it, and yet we still are seeing people coming into our programs who I think are used to using the internet to shop, And the way they think about it then is, okay, I'm going to shop for the information I need to support what I already believe is, the answer to this question. And so this is, in fact, not a digital skill per se. It's a much more fundamental skill of the sort that Matt is speaking of. And I think the idea of maybe being able to break students out of their mindset in the way that some of Kate's work does, and using other kinds of reasoning, maybe even visual reasoning, may be a way to kind of break them out of that trap. The second concern I have is about push-button data analytics. So I took my econometrics class as a PhD student from George Judge, who was at the Ag Econ department at Berkeley at the time. And he actually stood up in front of class and wept. He had a few tears coming down his cheeks as he talked about his use of matrix algebra to solve his first econometrics. I inverted the matrix, and it was so amazing. No one does that anymore. So I kind of wonder sometimes whether our students actually understand what they're doing when they have programs that are so easy to apply, such as Stata and R and Python. So that's one question. How do we actually know that students understand what they're doing without, in fact, having to teach them matrix algebra? I'm not sure where the middle ground is, but I'd be interested in hearing what folks think about that. The other point, I think, is something that I tell my students. I'm kind of mixed method researcher myself, so I understand the importance of numeracy, but numbers also can be used to cloak and hide important trade-offs. And so I fear sometimes that by advancing numeracy, we may be sacrificing other more qualitative understanding of public problems. And so, so this is kind of a dilemma about making sure that public service professionals aren't using analytics as a hammer, or I often think about what George Orwell said about the kind of use of the passive voice in writing, which is that bureaucrats use it, they're like squid, they just shoot out ink as they sort of retreat. And I think that's how numeracy also can be used as a way of hiding trade-offs, or essentially sort of cooking the answer that folks want. And so, I'd be very interested for those of you who are teaching in the sort of analytic core to understand how you address that dilemma. And then the third dilemma, I think, is about social media and how we use data authentically to engage people. And this is my point that, one of my earliest articles was a content analysis of municipal websites, and it was called something colon. There's always the colon. Good management or good democracy. And the question was, are municipalities using websites essentially to reinforce managerial imperatives and to kind of, in more of a municipal corporate function, or are they actually using web technology, as one might, to engage the citizenry? And I can ask my students now, I wrote this like more than 2 decades ago, which do you think it was? And everyone always says, oh, it's managerial imperatives. Right, that's true. I think that's still the case. And I think, part of my sort of frustration about this, I think, is because I spent many years studying neighborhood governance in Los Angeles, and I saw how Los Angeles municipalities managed to shield themselves from having individuals walk in and figure out what they're doing. And we actually had an undergraduate student who spent almost a year trying to get the Department of Parks and Recreation to provide information about their park association meetings. And she would show up at a park office and ask to speak to the manager and would be turned away. It's incredible how LA manages just to surround itself with barriers. So I have students now in our policy analysis practicum doing a project for the LA Fire Department, which is developing standards of coverage, and they need to engage the public. And so they want our students to do a survey, which you can do easily using technology. And so my students are coming at this, and I said, well, is a survey actually civic engagement? Oh, they kind of I said, go read some work on civic engagement. And so then they have this sort of difficult task of how do you actually think about engaging people in a city of 4 million people almost 100 community councils, and that, with the fire department, which is only seen when there's an emergency, and yet does a lot of functions that are critically important, how do you break that down? One would think that there would be a way to use social media to do it, but the city isn't doing that. And our students then are kind of left at sea trying to think about how they might do it. And so I think that's a challenge, thinking about how to join sort of technology design and civic engagement that we could be thinking about in our curriculum, so that we have sort of train our students to use technology to break down barriers between people and republic, as opposed to reinforcing them. So that's all I have, and I guess it's time for discussion.
So I think that's certainly true with respect to the need to have some sort of idea of how you can integrate non-administrative and non-numeric or textual data, right? And there's all sorts of different sensory inputs of various stripes that get captured and are being turned into content that can be analyzed. I guess what I'm more worried about with my students is making sure that they understand, what can doing something like deconstructing video data from a street camera actually tell them, right? And what can it not? So in LA with traffic ticket lights, right? They had to give those up because legally people went to the courts and said, yeah, that was my license plate, but it wasn't me. And you have no proof that it was me driving my car. Maybe it was a joyride. And so if they don't have the critical skills or critical thinking skills to go, well, is a deconstructed license plate the same thing as saying we can definitively put person X, whose other data we have here, and integrate that, they're going to just end up drawing wildly inaccurate conclusions. So I can let the more sophisticated data scientists deal with giving them the technical skills for deconstructing images, but I want them to know whether they should be bothering to do it in the first place.
There's a writing idea that I have, and I've thought about this at maybe 10%. So I'm gonna I'm gonna bake this as I try to answer your question. So keeping with the Sigmund Freud reference, if we think about, I believe it's, civilization and our discontents and something like that, and he's talking about the need to fit in with society, but also keep it, there's this innate want to have an expression of our individuality. And I think that's a kind of a different way to state your argument in terms of the benefits for society and the risk of harm. But I will say that I do think that there is, not only from an organizational level, but from a personal level, that there is a need and there is an understanding that what I am voluntarily giving up in terms of data in a lot of cases, I'm not thinking about those instances where data is taken from you, but where I'm voluntarily giving up data, I don't know what's going to happen with it. And there might be some experimentation that's needed with data to produce some type of objective good policy outcome. But because after my data goes into the ether and I don't know what happens with it, there is still an interest of me still being who I am and having some sort of domain over my data and my individuality. Where I think you see this playing out by way of example is there's a lot of really interesting scholarship around facial recognition data, where there are instances where people who, after they realize that they are having their facial image taken, which, public domain, you can take freely under, American jurisprudence, really, that they are actually going out of their way to smile bigger, act more happy, even though that may in fact not be the case, because they know they're being filmed and they don't want to be. But the idea of the program is that, whatever it might be to catch criminals, it might be to see walking patterns at certain times. I mean, the program the program very much could vary. But I will say that as you extrapolate that to an organizational level, I think there is starting to be more of an understanding that when we collect data for a certain purpose, that if we stray from that and we're not protecting the data and we're not doing the things that we say that how we're going to safeguard it, then that is where potential harms can come, which we're still not really able to quantify all that well in most cases. That you see more of a interest upon organizations to act more cautiously in that regard.
It's sort of an arms race. And as soon as we build the frameworks and the guardrails, they're already, yes.
I would concur. It's baked into the way the internet started, which was to consider it an open source, kind of a open bazaar, right? Here was an open platform to write your own programming with no thought to the governance structure. And so much like Freedom of Information Act and how it evolved on a very simplistic level, right? We are in fact playing catch up on the regulatory, and our problem is our legislatures and regulators know very little about what it is they're doing for rulemaking. We haven't yet educated them or their staff to understand the implications, which are speeding ahead of us, because the market is in fact incentivized to create new models that we have, still playing catch up. And that's the history of the SEC with derivatives. It's the nature of our regulatory, environment that we live in.
I guess what I would suggest as one possibility is how I have actually structured this single course, right? So my class is the gateway. Everyone has to come through me to be able to go on and finish the certificate. And so I actually have the class in many ways, figuratively and literally bifurcated, where I'm talking them through, okay, so this is what it means to make decisions in an administrative context, right? Here's some Herbert Simon and thinking about the way that organizations come to decisions in order to take action. And then, on the other half is, okay, so here's how you can think about ways in which you have some sort of question that's driving the need for your organization to make a decision. What kind of data, just going out and seeing what's actually live in the world, could we try to collect and systematically clean and make ready for analysis and do the analysis and so on, that can help you have the best shot at making the right decision. So it's really the class, much to the chagrin of some of my students who thought they were going to just be taking a class on learning how to write Python. It's both. They're getting the exposure, but in the very same class, they're understanding why and how to use it properly.